So for example number 1, we have a can I continuation bet any 2 cards profitably here spot. So let's suppose we open in the cutoff in the button flats while the blinds fold. The flop comes king of diamonds, 4 of clubs, 4 of spades. Let's pause and think for a moment. Can we bet any 2 cards in our range here in theory? Why or why not? While there is a correct answer here, it's not one we can solve for, so make your best guess. And when I say can we bet any 2 cards in our range in theory here, I mean can we bet any 2 cards here profitably? So there will be a correct answer here. There actually is a theoretical solution, even though no one knows it. So just pause for a moment and think, why do I think I can or I can't bet any 2 cards here profitably? So once again, pause for a moment and think, and then we'll go ahead and move on, though I imagine the vast majority of people won't actually pause. And so I think we likely can, since our opponent cannot have any combos of trips and is likely 3-betting most ace-king combos, if not all of them. So even just making the flop queen 4-4 makes this flop much difficult to bet with any 2 cards here and expect to make a profit. Because our opponent is likely going to be flatting with ace-queen, and will likely be raising ace-king pre-flop, so just changing the king to a queen lets our opponent have a ton more strong hands, and then if he does decide to raise those hands for value, then he's allowed to randomize a lot of bluffs. So changing just this flop texture from king 4-4 to queen 4-4 changes it substantially. Now, if we can bet any 2 cards here profitably, do we necessarily need to bet our entire range? So I mentioned this earlier, but it's an extremely important question. Pause for a moment and think, if we can bet any 2 cards here profitably, does that mean we should be betting our entire range? Is there a contradiction in our thought process if we think every hand makes a plus EV bet, yet we're not betting our entire range? So pause for a moment and think. And the answer is no with an exclamation mark. Just because a hand is plus EV to bet does not mean it won't be more plus EV to check. Think of a hand like queens. This concept gets a lot of people confused. Just because you can profitably bet with a hand does not mean you should. This can get even more tricky in other spots where you'll notice sometimes really, really good players will actually pass up on an extremely profitable bluff spot to hope for a more profitable bluff spot later. So for example, a very, very good player might float on the flop, check back the turn once his opponent checks to him on the turn, so he can bluff the river and represent a more, marginal value hand that's value betting very thin, and then that actually lets him balance out on the river with some bluffs. Most people don't do that. Most people insta-bet all their bluffs on the turn once the opponent checks to him on the turn if their opponent bet on the flop, because now they think, oh, yeah, I'm going to make money with my flop float because my opponent bet the flop and now he checked the turn. Really, really good players actually have the discipline to check back the turn and bluff on the river. Not many people are capable of doing that, so it's actually a very, very good line against good players. So there's a lot of spots where you should be passing up on a profitable betting spot to bet later, and this is probably the most common example where you have sort of a marginal hand that's like, well, I could bet and still make money, but it's better off checking. You can actually still do that with bluffs, which is a really cool move to have in your arsenal that not many people are capable of. So now let's ask this question, which is, if we can make a plus EV bet by bluffing on the flop, does it ever make sense to have a check folding range, since when we fold, our EV is 0? So we're once again trying to check for contradictions in our thought process and see if everything makes sense. So if we know we can make a plus EV bet by betting on the flop, then should we ever be check folding on the flop? Because if we check and our opponent bets and we fold, then our EV at that point is 0. So does it make sense to have a check folding range if we know we can bet with any 2 cards? Once again, pause for a moment and think. If you pause for a moment, think, and get this wrong or right, you'll remember it much better than if you just watch me go through the slides. And the answer is yes, it makes sense to have a check folding range. Our opponent won't always bet, so our EV won't always be 0 after we check. We have to think about the EV of a hand after our opponent checks back and the frequency at which he checks back. So that's a really important thing to think about. So a hand, for example, this is actually going to get to be a very tricky spot, so I don't want to go too much into detail here, but it can make sense to, if we're checking hands like queens, let's say, on this flop, maybe we're even checking some kings, then as we already sort of talked about, we're going to need to have some bluffs on the turn for when we value bet those hands. So we might want to check with a hand like, let's say, ace-jack on this flop, even though we could properly bet it on the flop, because when our opponent checks back the flop, then the bluff on the turn might be more profitable.